The Iron Door, written by Chad Mendenhall, narrated by Shannon Mendenhall. Dedicated to Maida Stanger. Levi's weary eyes squinted against the sun as it prepared to lower behind the horizon. Scanning the border of the Waldron family ranch, he watched as two small dust devils moved together in a stunning promenade of sweethearts caught in a tender exchange. As the dance continued to churn dust into the air, it carried something familiar to Levi. He sensed it carried trouble. Trouble first came to the Malad Valley in 1856 when Levi was 6 years old. Food was scarce for the little family in their new home. Grasshoppers had eaten the crops and wolves fed on most of their livestock. For weeks his mother Emmeline boiled pigweeds and thistle roots for greens. One evening, Levi was startled by his mother beating the flour bin and sobbing, "I don't know where the next mouthful of bread is coming from." Emmeline had managed to pound enough flour from the bin that night to make 2 small breakfast pancakes for her 2 young boys. As conditions and the availability of food in the valley continued to deteriorate, a desperate Bannock Indian barged into the Waldron home, drew a knife, and demanded food. The silt and perspiration on his weathered face outlined a deep scar that ran from the bottom of his right ear along the jawline to the other side of his chin. The man's eyes were nervous and intense. In one smooth, fluid motion, Emmeline spun from her place and grabbed a large stick out of the wood box. With her weapon instantly raised, it came down on the man's face with such force that he dropped his knife and fell to the floor. Scrambling to his feet, the stunned Bannock ran out of the door with Emmeline chasing him from the ranch, waving her stick in pursuit. Emmeline's adrenaline was overflowing on her walk back to the home, and she nearly missed the dark form crouching behind a large cluster of sagebrush and juniper. Without hesitation, she clutched her stick and headed toward the stirring form, determined to make a stand and establish herself as an unyielding pioneer. She called out of the bush, "Stand up and show yourself!" A disheveled figure stood up and stepped forward, crumbling Emmeline's anger. The woman's feet were swollen and bare, and she struggled to move at a reliable pace. It was evident that the child she was expecting would soon be delivered. "Your husband is a coward," she said. "But come inside. I'm sure we'll find something to eat." Twice, Levi and his family were forced to abandon their homestead, only to return weeks later after tension had settled. Over time, the pioneers and Indian tribes learned to live and work together peacefully, and after years of grit, toil, and fervent prayer, his family established a respectable ranch where he farmed, raised stock, and worked as the local blacksmith for the growing community. The trouble dancing in the summer wind didn't surprise Levi. He knew it would come eventually, and he knew it wouldn't involve the Indians. Ore mines in Montana, Idaho, and Utah bursting with gold and silver had attracted prospectors and miners along a 400-mile stretch known as the Gold Road. This provided a lifeline of riches and supplies for miners. It also supplied the vile misconduct and lawlessness these wandering miners attracted. Wild stories of stagecoach holdups, bank robberies, and attacks on homesteads along areas of the Gold Road had reached the settlements in Oneida County where Malad was situated. But those tales were exaggerated to excite and amuse settlers. They had always taken place farther south and north of the road where Levi's settlement occupied. He continued to watch the 2 dancing dust devils until the crest of the dropping sun cast its final array of majestic oranges and reds over the horizon. Levi's eyes darted as a shape moved through the whirlwinds, attempting to separate the companions as they moved together. The silhouette looked as if a horse was struggling to support something slumped atop its hastily saddled back. Levi learned a long time ago to carry his rifle wherever he went. It was a hard lesson, but one a boy will never forget in the punishing hills of southeast Idaho. After a long day clearing a section of field, Levi and his brother spooked a magnificent mule deer in pursuit of 3 or 4 does. Had the boys been armed, Emmeline's fresh venison stew would have been on the menu for weeks. Instead, the family lived on biscuits and potato mush. Levi was relieved to have his rifle this evening as he stood and waited for the horse to approach. After several minutes, it was clear there was a crumpled man hunched over the animal's withers. His right arm dangled with each movement of the horse, and it was covered in thick, hardened blood. The man was alive, but just barely. Groaning, he managed to raise his head enough to expose a bullet wound through his shoulder and a filthy gash over his forehead. Without the foolishness to test fate, Levi reared his firearm, stepped forward, and said, "One twitch and you're in hell." Edward David Piquet was hard as nails. He had spent his entire life in work that shaped a sturdy boy into a healthy, powerful man. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with a frame and temperament to rival the meanest, crankiest buffalo, there was no question why people called him Big Dave. Just west of the Wyoming Territory's Teton Range of the Rocky Mountains is a shallow valley called Pierre's Hole. This basin was an early and strategic center of fur trade for trappers and mountain men. In 1832, hundreds of traders met in a rendezvous to sell furs and trade for supplies. The gathering ended in a violent battle between a group of Groven Indians and a party of American traders aided by other Indian allies. Several years later, the area was settled by pioneers, with Big Dave's family among a group from Boston expanding west. Pierre's Hole and the Teton Mountains provided a fertile but elevated valley to graze cattle, raise feed, and haul lumber. In his early years, Big Dave labored tirelessly with his large family as they worked the land together. Then, in his 16th year, he was put to hauling lumber and freight as far south as the Salt Lake Valley and westward toward the Sawtooth Mountains and Salmon River in the Idaho territories. He soon discovered the freedom transporting cargo afforded. He cherished his independence and looked for any opportunity to trek through the developing western region. In the beginning, Big Dave never looked for trouble, but somehow it always seemed to find him. He met the Ellett brothers on a large haul from Ogden City to Black's Fork of the Green River. Teams consisted of 16 mules or horses and 18 yokes of oxen on 3 wagons bound for Wyoming with flour and all kinds of merchandise. The haul back was heavily guarded to protect gold and silver bullion. The brothers manned one team together, while Big Dave manned another. The trip to Black's Fork was quiet and uneventful, but nights of swapping stories, laughing, and camping together forged a firm friendship between Big Dave and the Ellett boys. Byron was soft-spoken but fearless, and his younger brother Jackson was as lively as a coyote with a temper and tolerance for pain matched only by Big Dave. As men look back on their lives, they tend to see more clearly how small things make big differences. Trouble's tipping point came to the 3 men on the 3rd evening of their journey home when they disputed the company's wages. Tempers boiled over and an intense gunfight led to the death of 2 men. Big Dave and his new friends fled the scene with several horses and pack mules loaded with gold. A posse was formed, but the fugitives' tracks vanished in the rocky terrain. The men figured it was too late to explain their side of things because despite any reasoning, their position didn't look good. They had killed 2 men and ran off with the gold. Besides, the thrill and wealth these men experienced overshadowed their shame and led them searching for more. They were wanted men who loved the chase and could vanish just as quickly as they appeared. After several months of well-prepared stagecoach holdups and small bank raids, Big Dave and the Ellett boys had made off with a sizable stash of loot. Overlooking the southwest edge of Malad Valley is a small mountain range named after the town settled in the shadow of its tallest peak. John Taylor, a Mormon apostle who witnessed the murder of Joseph Smith, the church's leader and prophet, visited this small community and named it Samaria after the Good Samaritan people who settled the area. The Samaria Mountains are linked to the Bannock Range along an outstretched spur ridge known as the Blue Spring Hills, which runs north for nearly 30 miles to connect the 2 ranges. These mountains offered a fine hideout for Big Dave and his companions. The range was hardly used, its valleys scarcely populated, and its peaks exposing a panoramic view of the entire area leading to their camp. Any movement headed for the security of their shelter would have been detected miles before a posse arrived, making escape certain. With loose shale covering the hardened dirt below, and a mystical turf that made each turn indistinguishable from the next, the Samaria Mountains deceived the most experienced trackers, guaranteeing a secluded retreat from search parties. Malad was a junction point along the Gold Road. Stage lines, freight outfits, and prospectors from Butte to Salt Lake put loads of treasure on the move over miles of wide, unprotected country. The new band of thieves were careful to conduct their business far from their hideout to direct suspicion away from the valley and mountains of Samaria. They often employed half-concealed dummies along the road to resemble armed men assisting their attacks, and would occasionally travel great distances to purchase supplies and ransack banks along the way. On the west bank of Utah's Bear River, where the Union Pacific Railroad crosses the water, rests the lively town of Corinne. Known as the gentle capital of Utah, Corinne was an end-of-the-trail town where travelers would restock supplies and rest at one of its many alluring saloons. Supposing to profit from Corinne's movement of wealth, Big Dave and the Ellett brothers were disappointed to find the charred ruins of its bank and neighboring buildings scattered into the streets, but among the debris was an item that captured their attention. The bank had used an old hobnail safe to secure its patrons' assets from fires and burglaries. These safes were built from strong wooden boxes interwoven with hammered sheets of iron to add strength and durability. The wrapped iron was then fastened to the box using large spikes with big round heads. These heads covered the exterior of the safe, designating its hobnail name and style. A fire from the previous evening had destroyed the bank and critically damaged its safe. Although its contents had been preserved, the fire and building's collapse delivered a large crack along the front corner of the safe, causing its door and frame to separate from the box. Eager to rid himself of a heavy piece of litter, the banker never questioned the three men as they paid generously for the safe door and hauled it away. Cut into the granite mountainside of the men's hideout was a natural cave with a small opening that led into a large room. The men discovered this cavern on their first night and had used it since as a place to hide their spoils. Entrance to the secret storage cellar required the men to crawl through its cavity for a few feet before it finally opened. When Big Dave and the brothers were away, they'd conceal the cave's small opening with brush and dirt. After their trip from Corinne, the men wasted no time putting their new iron door to work. The safe door, still attached to its severed frame, weighed nearly 80 pounds, stood 35 inches high, 24 inches wide, and wedged nearly perfectly as it was inset 2.5 feet into the cave's opening. The brothers hammered nail spikes as shims to secure each section of the door straight into the mouth of the cave's floor, ceiling, and walls. Big Dave then combined a thick mixture of dirt, clay, sand, grass, and water to all 4 sides of the door from both inside and outside the frame. This eliminated slight gaps, concealed each spike, and anchored the iron door with a cement fuse just as solid as the rock it was fastened to. Over the next 3 years, the thieves ransacked stage lines, banks, shipping wagons, and the occasional freight car. Careful to protect their plunder, they packed their granite vault with gold and silver bullion, paper money, and other valuables collected along the Gold Road. They continued to mask the cave entrance with undergrowth and insisted on covering their tracks to and from camp by erasing any sign of activity. The people of Malad Valley and those pursuing Big Dave's crew never suspected the Samaria Mountains or surrounding areas to contain so much treasure. "We can't do this forever," said Byron one evening as he observed a clump of red coals glowing in the campfire. "Just as these flames will finally snuff out, so is our fate if we don't make plans and clear out of the area." The cloudless sky illuminated their campsite as stars cut through the darkness with the moon stretched directly over them. They talked until the sun peeked over the summit, planning a cloaked exit from their dishonest trade. The plan was simple. The men would load their treasure and supplies on 2 covered wagons, head west to California or the Oregon Territory, then sail to South America, purchase a sizable ranch, and retire discreetly. By now, most folks in settlements along the Gold Road had been on the lookout for 3 unfamiliar fellas. To prevent suspicion, Big Dave and Byron left Jackson at the hideout while they rode in to purchase supplies for their trip west. They split up just before reaching town, going their separate ways to secure items. Just as Byron had reached the general supply store, he heard commotion to his left and saw the local deputy and 2 other men attempting to corner Big Dave. His large frame had betrayed him, and Big Dave knew he'd been identified. Alarmed, Byron drew his handgun, shouted to the crowd, and shot the first man who turned toward him. As the man fell, he hit Byron in the chest with buckshot fired from a double-barreled scattergun. Byron fell back in a slight teeter just before he slumped to his knees and died in the dirt road. The gunfight was over before anyone in town realized what was happening. No sooner had Byron hit the ground than 2 other bodies met the same fate as Big Dave's gun fired only twice, killing the remaining men. Big Dave was quick to shake off the posse hunting after him, careful to lead a merry chase away from the Samaria Mountains. Convinced his trail was cold and his trackers miles away in the other direction, he double-backed once more, then tucked himself away in a large thicket of junipers for a time before making his way to the iron door. Jackson was plainly agitated when Big Dave and his horse arrived 5 days after they had left. His alarm quickly escalated into distress and outrage when he learned that Byron was not with him. He agonized over the loss of his brother and accused Big Dave of treachery. Jackson drew his weapon and fired on Big Dave, hitting him in the shoulder. "Don't do this!" Big Dave shouted as he found cover behind a large clump of sagebrush and fired back with his rifle. Jackson shrieked as a bullet shattered his femur and severed the main artery. He fell to the ground, emptying his handgun into the bushes where his friend had scrambled. Big Dave felt a searing pain across his back where a bullet had grazed him, exposing a 4-inch opening just north of his hip. A second bullet tore through his side, puncturing his lung. After several long seconds, he peered through the bushes where Jackson lay dead. Big Dave stumbled to his horse and lurched his wounded arm over its neck. Steadying himself on a large rock, he twisted his hip to propel his leg over the saddle. Wrapping his hand around the leather reins to make the final wrench forward, Big Dave's mind surrendered to a muddle of images and jumbled thoughts until he lost consciousness and collapsed. Hours later, Big Dave's eyes opened as he was startled by the sound of 2 dust devils thrashing dirt in an angry fight between 2 cruel enemies. Nightfall had cast an imminent display of oranges and reds as he realized his situation was hopeless. His throat burned and his head was in misery. The horse's pace quickened as it attempted to escape the dueling whirlwinds, and after several minutes the punishing trot slowed, then stopped. Slumped helplessly over his horse, Big Dave felt someone watching him and heard the familiar click of a lever action chambering its round. "One twitch and you're in hell," said a low, firm voice. "No sense wasting your bullet on a dead man," Big Dave said as he released his grip and fell to the ground unconscious. Big Dave woke to a cold washcloth on his forehead and bandages covering his wounds. His straw mattress was comfortable, but his body ached. He watched as a young boy, probably 7 or 8, sat on a stool guarding his outlaw prisoner. Sitting intently, the young boy spoke. "Daddy told me to find him when you wake. He said you're dangerous, but he's not scared." "What is your name?" asked Big Dave. "Gillespie." "Are you afraid?" "Nope," Gillespie said, shaking his head. "If Dad isn't afraid, neither am I." "Come here, boy," whispered Big Dave. "Listen closely, because I've got little time left, and there's something you should know." Big Dave told Gillespie about the Ellett brothers, their 4-year crime spree, and the iron door. He described its treasures and where to find the hideout. "I cleared out the campsite as best I could and covered the door," he said. "It won't be easy to find, but when you do, Don't be afraid of what's waiting in there for you. I couldn't bury Jackson, so I put him there to guard the gold." Word travels fast in a small community, and before long, a U.S. Marshal arrived with a few detectives, as well as some locals. The lawmen questioned Big Dave as best they could, but it was clear his health was dwindling and death was imminent. The night of his death, a fever overwhelmed him, and delirium set in. Big Dave told those present about the iron door in the mountains, but stopped short of revealing its location. He died late that evening and was buried the next day in the Malad City Cemetery. Big Dave's story circulated through the area and created a frenzy of townsfolk, agent, and treasure hunters combing the hills of Samaria and Malad Valley for hidden gold. Attorneys laid claim on anything discovered, but years of searching failed to uncover a single Indian head penny. Even though the Waldron family refused to let Big Dave's deathbed confession concern them, the iron door was always in the back of Gillespie's mind. Homesteading never afforded much leisure, but one day Gillespie found himself close to the place Big Dave had secretly disclosed more than a decade earlier. He was rounding up stray horses in an area of the mountains unfamiliar to him. The sky hurled a dismal October overcast with rain and slight snow showers impeding a clear view. Just as Gillespie was about to abandon his search, he spotted a slender recess in the rock wall. Barely visible, with underbrush and rubble lining the mountainside, the niche created a momentary shadow on the top right corner. 10 minutes later, Gillespie had cleared just enough space to peer through the opening of a cave entrance. Although it was dark inside, and very little light from outside the cave afforded much visibility, his eyes fixated on a dark hobnail door that blocked admission to the hollow. Gillespie's heart raced. He had found the iron door. Without tools or light to open the vault, he was careful to conceal his tracks and any evidence of the cave. His ride home was full of excited thoughts, with plans to return and quietly collect Big Dave's gift. That evening, modest snow showers turned into heavy flurries that blanketed the entire valley in thick snow, bringing the worst winter in more than 30 years. Temperatures quickly dropped and did not return to bring spring until mid-May. The last frost date was later than it had traditionally been, and everyone was in a scramble to get their crops planted. The whole valley came together, helping wherever they could for their neighbors and families. Snowdrifts destroyed Levi's barn, causing it to collapse on one side. The family worked all summer to clear the area, strengthen the foundation, and rebuild the structure. Then came each harvest, hay baling, irrigation fields, digging wells, and plenty of other chores to keep Gillespie from his treasure. Weeks turned into months, and months into a full year before Gillespie had time to scale the mountain again. He brought 4 of his younger brothers along, each with tools to pry open the iron door and bags to haul the gold. When they arrived where Gillespie remembered, the cave entrance and iron door had disappeared. He recognized the area and knew they were in the right spot, but everything looked different. The earth and game trails were out of place, vegetation had expanded, and it seemed the rock wall had been altered. "Does anything look familiar?" asked Gillespie's brother Nathaniel. "Everything looks familiar!" exclaimed Gillespie. The boys spent the next 2 days climbing rocks and following trails to inspect every crevice, stone pile, or clump of dirt. They went home disappointed and just as penniless as they were when they had arrived. Each time Gillespie and his brothers went back to resume their search, they came home empty-handed, never to discover the iron door. The Bannock Indians who settled the valley long before pioneers arrived told bizarre stories of thundering sounds or angry rumblings in the mountains, typically occurring in the spring of each year. The ranchers suggested these sounds were no more than the earth settling or dropping as the frost left the ground. So it was with Gillespie and all those who searched for the iron door. Rockslides, shift in the earth's surface, and overgrown brush had changed the landscape and completely covered the iron door. The outlaw's absurd tale was eventually attributed to his delirium and denounced as fiction. Although some still believe in the legend of the iron door and continue the search, Most people in the valley tell the story around campfires and road trips as local folklore. The end. This has been The Iron Door, written by Chad Mendenhall, narrated by Shannon Mendenhall.